What?
Father,
Hello.
please, this is Joseph Asante from Ghana. I'm in the Diocese of Konongo-Mampong.
Oh, yes, Father.
I'm a catechist from the diocese.
Yes.
There's a little question that I want to ask, since we are not getting any feedback from Prof.
I think it's come back.
Okay. I'm
Yeah,
having a little bit challenge with my network here.
Okay.
So I'm hiding somewhere.
Okay.
So now that the country is spending much than what we gain, what are we going to do as the church in the country? Because if you take Ghana, for instance, right now, from the parliament and majority of the ministers are from the church, I mean the Catholic Church. What are we doing to help the country to gain all the revenue that we need, that we can spend to improve the country? Unlike other countries, they are having a lot of ministers who are in the church and they are helping the countries. But Ghana here, we are not having that thing being done here. What are we doing as the church? Are we to educate them or what? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, certainly an important question. Should I proceed or the question is going to be answered?
Yes, Prof, please proceed. We'll look at the answers during the next session.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Sorry about that. I think signs of the time. Actually, Emmanuel had warned me that perhaps I should come to the offices in case the internet is unstable. But anyway, the alert just went off. So now, you can see that after the HIPIC program, Ghana's debt levels really came down. But since then, we've been working very hard to build it up. So you can see since it bottomed out in 2006, it's been on the rise since. And then since 2000 in particular, you can see that we've seen a huge spike. And then since we did the debt exchange, it looks like now it's heading down a little bit. But that's really the situation with Ghana's debt. And really this is what informed our decision to go to the IMF. It's a big part of our decision to go to the IMF. Now, so let's talk about the IMF program as we have it now. As we know, this is the 17th time that we've gone to the IMF for support. This time it sounded a little different. I think from the beginning of the year 2022, it was obvious that the economy was in serious trouble. But the government, led by the finance minister at that time, insisted that we shouldn't go to the IMF for support. And then as the crisis deepened, in the third quarter, I think it took the president to announce that we are going to the IMF for the 17th time, having exited the previous program only 3 years or so earlier. Now, usually when you approach IMF for a program, you have to show that your debt is sustainable. That means, given your current financing conditions, you can continue to service your debt. But that was not the case for Ghana. So the IMF conducted a debt sustainability analysis and concluded that Ghana's debt was not sustainable. And what that meant is that we had to do a debt restructuring. We had to restructure the debt by renegotiating the terms in terms of interest and repayment period, or even if there will be some possible debt cancellation, to bring the debt to levels that are sustainable before we could continue with the program. Now, a little bit about why we go here. I think the immediate trigger of the crisis was that starting from late 2021, a lot of the rating agencies downgraded Ghana's credit rating to levels that meant that we could no longer access the international capital market. So that's really what triggered the problem. So it meant that in the 3 years prior, what Ghana had been doing is we had been continuing spending beyond our means. But every year we do an Eurobond where we borrow in dollars to support the economy. That's what we have been doing at least for the 3 years prior. So the moment it was announced that we the downgrade meant that we couldn't borrow again in the international capital market. Then everything went down south. So we saw a lot of capital flow reversals, and suddenly the currency worsened and the price levels skyrocketed. Now, but in terms of why the debt has built up, I think a few other things have happened. I think in the 2018 to 2020, Ghana did what we call a financial sector cleanup, where some financial institutions were seen not to be viable. So the government decided that it will allow, and also the central bank had decided that the minimum threshold for operating a bank was increased. It was increased almost fourfold. So all of these meant that some people, some banks went under, and the government decided to absorb the cost of that. So as of today, nobody really know what the final cost is, because every day we keep hearing new numbers in terms of the cost. So that contributed to that. But also, the energy sector in Ghana has been a major problem. It's been one of the biggest weaknesses of the economy. So in 2019, the government launched the Energy Sector Recovery Program. Unfortunately, what it decided to do was to absorb the shortfalls within the energy sector. The shortfalls comes because government had been giving electricity subsidies, and that meant that we were not paying, Ghanaians were not paying up to the level. And to make matters worse, I think in 2018, the government decided to announce about 30% across the board reduction in electricity tariffs at a time where we were already struggling to pay up. So all of those became a big part. So now what has happened is that in 2010, Ghana became a lower middle income country. And one of the implications of that was that we were not getting as much concessional credit as in the past. And around that time, Ghana's appetite for borrowing on international capital market rose. So you realize that in the graph that I'm showing you governance external debt by different sources. So we have the multilateral, which is what we owe to the IMF, the World Bank, and other development institutions. Then we have the international capital market, essentially the Euro bonds that we do. Then we have the yellow, which is the other commercial, where we borrow commercially from other entities. Then we have the bilateral. So the bilateral is what is country to country. So when you look at this graph, what tells you is that over time, in terms of a composition of our debt, the international capital market became the biggest, starting from being only 18.2% in 2014. By end of 2022, it was almost half of our total credit. Now, one thing to note is that these are borrowings on commercial terms. So usually the interest rates tend to be very high. You're not going to have any grace period, and it's very expensive to pay those loans. But at the same time, in some sense, the accountability for those kind of loans are lower. So we do a prospectus, go and borrow that you're going to use for purpose A or B. But essentially, when we have the money, we use it anyhow. So I think that this is a big part. The fact that the composition of our debt changed to we are now taking on more expensive debt rather than the bilateral and the multilateral, which tends to be relatively cheaper because they'll give you a longer period to pay and the interest on them are lower. Now, so a consequence of that is that by 2020, 2022, it was extremely difficult for government to even service the loans. So the figure I'm showing you is looking at many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and the fraction of our revenues that we use to service the loan. So Ghana is close to 50%. What that meant is that for every CD that the government of Ghana collects, almost half of it is used to pay interest on loans. And that means that you have nothing to do anything else. If half of all your revenue is paying interest, then after paying workers, there's nothing for government to undertake any program. So you can see Ghana sitting alone at the top. The closest to us was Malawi. But then if you look at even Sub-Saharan African average, many countries are paying no more than 10% of their revenues in terms of servicing their interest. But Ghana's case go away. So all of this cumulated in we having to go to the IMF. But I think I have to say, these problems are structural. They are problems that has been there for long. And the problem has been that as a country, we don't collect enough taxes and we spend beyond our means. So when I say we don't collect enough taxes, it doesn't mean that we don't have enough different taxes. But the way we structure the taxes, they are so inefficient. And then I was happy to hear Neil talk about the role of multinational companies. So later on, you see that part of our problem is that we give so many exemptions to profitable multinational companies. And that means they can be here for a decade without having to pay any tax at all. So even though we have many, many different type of taxes, the collection has always been problematic because sometimes we give powers to the parliament and also the executives who can just give exemptions to companies. And then, of course, government has struggled to control its spending. So one of the main problems that we have had is that even after we've drawn the budget, the public expenditure control systems are so weak that people can spend outside of the budget. So there are many occasions where people will spend, when I say people in government institutions, they can spend money without prior approval of parliament. And we spend money outside of what has been budgeted for. So those have been problems that we've always had. And then, of course, the electricity sector challenges started to pile on. So this is one way of looking at when we say that we spend monies we don't have. So I'm showing you there are three types of bars. So there's the orange one, which tells us the total revenue and grants. And then we have the dotted one, which tells us our expenditure. And then the difference between the two is what reflects in the budget deficit. So you notice that consistently, the revenue has remained flat, right? If you look at the orange line, in terms of our revenue as a ratio of our GDP, has largely remained flat. But you see that the expenditure part has been going up. And so the blue line at the bottom, which tells us that we are spending more than we are collecting, keeps getting longer and longer. So it keeps getting deeper and deeper into the negative, telling us that we are spending monies we don't have. So, and then we've also had, it's common to hear that the COVID-19 pandemic and then the problems in Russia and Ukraine have contributed to our problems. I mean, that is true. But as we can also see, we see that our problems started before anything called COVID-19 or Russia and Ukraine war. So clearly, those contributed to our problems, but we can't really blame our problems on what happened, or our problems on the pandemic as well as the Russian-Ukraine war. So the next thing is to talk about, so what are we doing with the IMF program? So up to this point, I've explained where our problems have come from. So the next thing is to talk about what are the key elements of the program that we are having with the IMF. So one of the key elements is actually to restructure our debt, which was deemed unsustainable, to bring it to sustainable levels. So for a long time, Ghana has been a category called high risk of debt distress. That means that your debt levels are such that you struggle to pay, or you can, you are in a distressed state. You can't really pay your debt. Now, the goal of the debt restructuring is to ensure that we change we discuss with our debtors the interest on the debt, as well as how we are going to pay, to ensure that by 2028, the debt levels come to what we call moderate risk. And so that was a big part. The debt restructuring is a big part of the IMF program that we have undertaken. Then another one has to do with fiscal consolidation. In the beginning, I explained that it is spending monies we don't have that actually build up the debt. So yes, you might do something to bring the debt down, but you need to address in some sense the root cause. So part of the program is to do what you call fiscal consolidation. And when you hear fiscal consolidation, it's just another word for saying that we are going to tighten our belt. That means government has to reduce how much it's spending or raise more revenue. It turns out that in this particular program, the government made a decision that we will spend more on revenue collection, collect more revenue, and not necessarily spend more or also, there are weaknesses in Ghana's fiscal regime, i.e., our revenue collection and public expenditure controls. There are weaknesses. So part of the program is also to undertake a lot of reforms that will ensure that these weaknesses are addressed. And then another element is to strengthen the conduct of monetary policy and exchange rate policy, as well as to strengthen the stability of the financial system. And then, of course, to also do reforms that would generally improve governance in the country. I think everybody in Ghana knows that corruption has always been a big problem. So there are some elements of the program that attempts to deal with the corruption element, but we will speak about them. So in essence, this is how we got into the IMF program, and that is what the program has been trying to do. So now I'm going to talk about, take some of the important elements, especially the debt and the fiscal element, and then try and see what we have done so far, and then what I see going forward. Now, a big part of the current IMF program was to restructure the debt, which had become unsustainable. Now, the debt restructuring was divided into four main elements. The first element was to restructure the domestic debt. So there was this big thing in 2020, towards the end of 2022, called the DDEP, Domestic Debt Exchange Program, where the government kind of forced people who had learned to it to take lower terms, less favorable terms. So in total, the domestic debt at that time was about just over 23 billion USD, consisting of government long-term borrowing, other bills that the government had used to borrow. That has been completed. The domestic debt exchange component of the restructuring has been completed. Then we also had to restructure the bilateral. The bilateral debt is the one that we owe to other countries. So we owe some money to many different countries, China, many countries in the EU, and the United States and many other countries. So there's that component of the debt. Now, that was about 5.1 billion in total. Now, we are almost at the end of that. I think the MOU on the nature of the restructuring has been done, has been agreed. It's up to the individual countries to go through their own laws to try and complete the process. So it's almost completed, but it's not. The agreement has been done, but it's almost completed. Now, the bigger component to restructure was the Eurobond. The total amount of the Eurobond debt was about 13 billion. So that is also almost completed. I think by the end of last month, the government has received the tendering. I think it has offered new terms, and the Eurobond partners, many of them, about 98% or so, have agreed to subscribe. So now it's time to finish the paperwork and do the exchange, then that part will be completed. Then what they have moved their attention to is the commercial creditors. So the commercial creditors, we owe about 2.7 billion. And that discussion is now at the very early stages. So this is the kind of debt restructuring that we've been doing. Now, next, I'm going to show you the level of savings we've made from each one of them. So, I'm just reproducing the total debt. Sorry, the second column is mislabeled. That's the total debt. And then the third column is the amount of debt cancellation received. And then the final column is savings. Now, the savings come from the fact that for many of them, the interest rate have been reduced. So the amount that we were due to pay, when the interest rate reduced, it will bring us some savings. And also, part of this is that we succeeded in stretching out the the prepayment period. That also brings some form of savings. So the domestic debt exchange component, which we have finished, brought savings of about 61 billion. This is what the finance minister reported last year when he was reading the budget for this year. Now, in terms of the bilateral debt, which was 5 billion, there was no clear statement of debt forgiveness. And I think this is where many people, many of us are a little disappointed that our development partners, the bilateral debt, we did get some savings, mostly coming from postponing the repayment and reducing the interest. But in terms of getting reduction by way of debt cancellation, nothing really happened. Then is rather the Eurobond that the finance ministry managed to restructure is such that the nominal value of the debt was reduced by about 37%, which translates into about 4.7 billion. And then also because we managed to negotiate down the interest payment, that brings us additional savings of about 4.3. Now, the other component, which is the commercial, now the discussions have just started. Begin to see. Now, I think I'd like to re-emphasize this because we heard when Neil was talking, he was talking about the importance of debt forgiveness. And for me, it struck me that even with the IMF, to get a bilateral debt that involves no debt forgiveness, no debt cancellation at all, that for me seems surprising. Now, so I think the other thing that we should note about the restructuring is that much of what we have done is actually get debt service payment release up to the year 2026. So if you look at a lot of the terms of the restructuring, a lot of them means that a lot of the repayment, so the repayment are either reduced or they are postponed until 2026. So while that gives us temporary relief, it means that 2026, if nothing happens, all our problems will resurface. And I think this has been one of the more disappointing aspects of the debt restructuring that we've been doing. You know, many people felt that, well, we should get substantial reduction by way of the debt, but we really didn't get that. But I think the fact that we used the IMF program to postpone the fundamental problem, so at the moment, we are not paying as much. But in just 2 years, we have to start repaying. And I think the question remains, where are we going to get the funds to pay? So I think especially the impact on the currency. So if nothing really changes, and so far we haven't really seen the fundamental reforms that will actually change or will change our ability to service the debt from 2026. So it means that there's problem coming. I think what's like the current program will almost certainly be extended beyond 2026 because part of the key reforms have delayed. And then also, if you look at how we have pushed, kind of kicked the burden down the road without really doing anything to make sure that we are ready to deal with the actual, get the sense that if the program is not extended, then another restructuring might become necessary. So now let me talk about the fiscal accountability and governance, which really gets to, in some sense, the heart of the matter, the taxation and the spending patterns of the government. Now, I think the first thing I would say is that the whole process about seeking IMF support has really not been very accountable at all. From the very beginning, the government was denying the problems that we have and was denying that we will actually be going to the IMF. So instead of perhaps engaging in more broad-based discussion about the different problems we have, and then try and come up with what sacrifices who has to make to ensure that we go into this program. Deny, and then suddenly we are going. And when the announcement was made, we knew that the IMF and the government were discussing the terms, but we only got to find out after the IMF board approved it in May 2023. So we really didn't know what was being agreed. There had been a lot of calls from various quarters that the government should convene some kind of stakeholder consultation forum to share ideas on the difficulties that we are facing and how we might go about resolving it. That didn't happen. That has been very problematic. And another thing has been the way the whole domestic debt exchange was carried out. It was completely top-down, was and in some sense, the government appeared to use fear-mongering to get individuals and businesses to subscribe. So this is what happens. The government in December, I believe, 2022, announced the debt program. Even though he claimed that there was much discussion, the reaction of the bondholders tell you there wasn't any discussion at all. Because when it came out, it was complete outcry in terms of the new terms that the government was offering. You know, whether institutional creditors or individuals who have purchased government bonds or people, worker groups who have through pension funds had invested in government securities, there was complete outcry. And so that kind of belies the government statement that I had done in a consultation. So you realize that because of the outcry, it went through a series of changes to make sure that the terms were affordable or acceptable to many. But it was the initial terms were completely unacceptable. It looked completely unthinkable that a government would decide that this is how it will deal with its citizens. So that part, in terms of the accountability and engagement, was completely lacking. Now, throughout this process, the government is showing more accountability to the IMF than citizens. And I think that is quite problematic. Now, as we talk, there are very important, serious, long-term discussions and changes being made to Ghana's fiscal and monetary policy framework that's being agreed between the government and the IMF, with no public engagement, no discussion among any civil society groups. And generally, the government has not been very keen to listen to any suggestions from any group of civil society in terms of what changes we are doing to our fiscal policy framework. I think that part is really disappointing. Now, also, the fiscal consolidation really has lacked fairness and equity. Now, the first point is that, when you are spending, when you have a budget deficit, there are two sides. There's your revenue and there's your expenditure. Now, in the current program, the government decided that it will pay more attention to revenue mobilization, even though many Ghanaians have been complaining about the size of the government and its expenditures. But that really didn't feature into the program at all. So the only expenditure things that were done is to try and then impose expenditure controls. But instead, impose substantial cuts to government expenditure. That didn't happen. Now, so I think the other thing is that in the discussion before we went to the IMF, the government had promised that it was going to cut discretionary expenditures by 30% or so. It turned out that I couldn't do it because there's so much laxity in how government agencies can spend money that whatever was announced was not implemented. When the program document was released, it was clearly written in it that the government was not able to do that. Now, the other thing is that there seemed to be more preference for more punitive indirect taxes over more fundamental revenue measures. And the punitive indirect taxes have actually worsened living conditions of Ghanaian households and businesses. So, for instance, Ghanaians are paying more for electricity. Since the program started, electricity has gone up almost 80%. And then also a number of new taxes, indirect taxes on basic necessity has been imposed. Indeed, at the beginning of the year, the government was planning to taxes on electricity. And there was massive societal disapproval of that. and it decided to shelve it. So if you read the second review document of the IMF, it's clear that the government is not abandoning the idea. It just says that it's suspending the implementation because of social resistance. So clearly, these are some of the choices that the government has made with no attempt to kind of reduce the burden, the tax burden on Ghanaians. Now, another element is the preference for specific tax policy options seem to be at variance with the weaknesses in the tax system that an IMF tax diagnostic report identified. And in the next couple of slides, I'll show you. So the IMF had identified that Ghana has so many weaknesses in the tax system, and had recommended in the original document, had recommended specific areas that could be improved. And I felt that mostly, I'm not supportive of many things that the IMF say, but when you look at the proposal, you begin to see that some of them were actually reflection of the real problems that we have. So this graph here is more or less a diagnosis or a comparison of the government's different expenditure streams compared to our peers. So compared to our peers being other emerging and developing economies or low-income countries, or even our peers in Sub-Saharan Africa. Our peers in Sub-Saharan Africa is in red. Our peers in low-income countries is in the green shaded, and our peers in emerging markets are the other black and white, and then Ghana is the blue. So PIT is personal income tax. You see that on that, we are doing relatively okay because our levels are not dramatically different from our peers. The CIT is corporate income tax. On that also, you say we are not doing that badly. We are just there or thereabout. But the biggest weakness is in our VAT. So you see that our VAT, we are completely underperforming our peers and our neighbors. So you see that compared to doing less than half of what others are doing, even compared to other low-income countries, even compared to the Sub-Saharan African countries, we are doing way below. Then another area is excise taxes. This is taxes on specific items that are produced, specific taxes. And then the other element is taxes on international trade. So this is the kind of analysis and comparison that the IMF did to try and advise the government on where it should be looking for new revenue. Now, the more comprehensive prescription from
I think we lost Prof again.
Yeah.
Um, let's see if he's able to work his magic again.
Okay, sorry. I'm almost through with my presentation. So
Okay.
Next 5 minutes, I'll be done.
Okay.
Okay. So, and I think the other thing, so essentially the IMF the bullet number 2, the IMF was recommending that all these tax holidays that we are giving to profitable multinationals, we should stop them. And then also remove the exemptions we give at the port. So we know that there are a lot of the GRA commissioner has a lot of discretionary power to give all manner of exemptions. And, there's a sense that that's been heavily abused for political patronage. And then one element was also to make the tax system more progressive by reducing the burden on the poor and increasing the tax payment by the relatively wealthy people in society. So this was also another one of the recommended tax actions the IMF put out there in the document, the IMF document itself. And then, of course, it wanted fuel subsidies or fuel levies adjusted automatically. And then I think this one is a big one for me. I think it had advised the government that the extractive is one area where we are not collecting enough taxes. And also, we are not, the whole regime is such that Ghanaians are not benefiting from the exploitation of these minerals and oil and other things. So it had recommended strongly that we should completely change the fiscal regime to ensure that we are getting more from that sector. Unfortunately, as many Ghanaians will tell you, what has happened is essentially just introducing new indirect taxes and new consumption taxes. And so many of these have not been implemented at all. But I think there are also other, so apart from the exemptions, another area that was recommended, not from the tax diagnostics, has been property taxes. If you come to Accra, especially around the airport area, there are all these high-rise properties that many of them are not even occupied, that are owned by super rich people, but paying almost no property taxes at all. So discussion about making sure that people who are owning luxury properties are paying the required taxes to help show up, our tax revenue is something that the government has really struggled to undertake, even though we've done a lot of investment that has sought to digitize the location of all properties in the country. Now, in terms of expenditure control measures, well, there are a few. One of them is because there are so many cases where government officials can spend outside of the integrated financial management system, the GIFMIS. That is how financial management in the country happens. Now, there had been a recommendation that we strengthen and we fully integrate all public procurement into the system so that nobody can do any purchases outside of that. Now, I think that one, progress has been extremely slow, and the government had requested that the IMF, originally, I think government was supposed to do this by end 2013. The government has requested that it be shifted to June 2025. Obviously, you get a sense that because the election is coming, perhaps, some people still want the loose system to remain in place for whatever reason. And another thing that is being done is that the IMF is asking the government to change the Fiscal Responsibility Act. This is an act that imposes caps on the level of government spending and then, to some extent, indebtedness. This was first passed when we were in the last IMF program, but there were so many loopholes that the government was able to set it aside when the COVID-19 problem started. And because of that, that looseness has remained. We have not really returned to that. So there's a lot of discussion to change that. And of course, there are a lot of ongoing reforms to try and strengthen the Ministry of Finance oversight responsibility over the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises. The state-owned enterprises has been one of the weakest links in our public sector financial management. So we see that, government officials can simply get funding from SOEs to do all manner of things, including getting degrees and certification from abroad and from many other places. So all those are things that under the program, the IMF is trying to strengthen. And of course, there are government measures to reform governance. Now, for many Ghanaians, perhaps not dealing with the issue of official and public sector corruption is one of the major things. Here, even though some things are in the IMF program, things are not really going well. I think one of the things that civil society behind the back demanded was that there had been an audit of the COVID-related expenditure. And it had been requested that it should be made public. The audit would be made public. So the IMF actually made it a prior condition. And when that report was published, many Ghanaians were amazed that in the middle of the crisis, when Ghanaians were trying to survive. There's a lot of expenditure breaches and breaches of procurement law. So corruption has been a big part. Now, there's also the IMF has also conducted a governance corruption diagnostic assessment to try and identify weaknesses in our governance system that gives rise to corruption. That report was completed early in the year, and it has been handed to the government. You get the sense that the government is reluctant to release the report because it's an election year. But that really is supposed to help us to understand what weaknesses in our public expenditure system that we should. Okay, so my last 3 slides. Now, so generally, I think there's official communication is that government is doing well with the implementation. I think that, I mean, if you go by the program requirements, you say yes, they are following what is in the program. And then there's always been a communication that the macroeconomic environment of the macroeconomic indicators has improved. That is true. The macroeconomic indicators have improved from the terrible years of 2022, but they are still worse than even the 2022, I mean, the pre-2022 level. So it's still relative. But I think what is more concerning is that in spite of the improvement in the indicators, micro level data shows that economic conditions for Ghanaians have worsened. So I think there has been a report by the World Bank showing that food insecurity has worsened in the country, and the number of people who are suffering food insecurity has increased. And also the Ghana Statistical Service has been presenting data that shows that the fraction of Ghanaians who are becoming multidimensionally poor has been rising. So these are some of the things that have been going on. There are attempts to try and use, the program has some component on social protection, but obviously it's very limited in scope, and many Ghanaians are not really feeling the effect. So I'm down to my last 2 slides in terms of going forward, what can be done in terms of engagement. I think the first thing I want to say is that real important changes that will affect our lives going on are being made. Unfortunately, they are being made between the government and the IMF. For instance, there are important changes that are being made to the Bank of Ghana Act to kind of, in the words of the IMF, make it more independent. These are mostly consistent with how the IMF and the World Bank tend to see the world and how economy should be run. So those are going on. There's also Fiscal Responsibility Act. I think it would have been passed by now for the fact that in October, there's been some gridlock in Parliament and they've not been sitting. But the schedule of it for it to be submitted to the government for it to be passed. And then there are other structures that are going on that worryingly, I think they are not being publicly discussed, and there's very little engagement, and all of these are going on. I think many of these revisions, like I said, are driven by how the IMF see that the country should be run with no responsibility at all and no involvement of Ghanaians. Now, so in terms of what kind of engagement can happen? Well, I think the first thing we should understand is that the government has no interest in being accountable when it comes to its finances. There's no interest. They only do what they cannot get away with. So they will have to, the law says come to Parliament and read the budget, they will come and read. But if you look at how the posturing of the government, there's no interest. Even public documents will never be released until you go and file a right to information. So I think that is the context we should understand, that the government has no interest in being accountable, and we have to demand the accountability from the government. And to do that, we have to be informed ourselves. So I think it's important that we get to understand exactly what is going on, what are the changes that are going on, what are the processes that are going on. And then unfortunately, I have to say that there are better opportunities to get to know and to influence whatever is going on through the IMF than through our government. Because the IMF, as part of the program, it has a civil society forum that it consults. and then it tends to seek alternative opinions. And in some of the meetings I've been involved in, you notice that some of the concerns that are raised tend to find their way into the policy document. So there are a few things. For instance, I know that the insistence that the COVID-19 audit report was something that definitely came from civil society, who through the bank, the IMF, insisted that these things should be done. So I think we have to first be informed, and then also try and understand the opportunities for us to engage, and hopefully things will get better. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much, and apologies for the interruptions.
Well, thank you very, very much, Prof. I think you would all agree with me, dear participants, that both resource persons have been extraordinary in their mastery and presentation of their material. This is how I propose our way going forward in terms of our next part of the program of the interactions. I will begin by making some observations or asking a few general particular questions, and then I will throw the discussion open. You will be allowed to ask either of them a particular question if you let us know exactly who you want to go to, and then they will take the question. I will suggest after at that point that each resource person will take about 3 questions in a row, and then answer them. If that modus of operation is acceptable, then I will start, and I'll start with Neil. Neil, I'm sure that as you reflected on what the Holy Father had said in both documents of Laudato Si and Laudate Deum, you realize that in terms of thought, there is, if you want, a progression of the thinking itself, but also of the intensity of the language, which is used to, as it were, drive home the need for the care of an environment and dealing with the issues of poverty, therefore, if you want, wealth and poverty relations. My only a little surprise is the choice of the various hierarchy of church documents, because Laudato Si is an encyclical, and Laudate Deum is an apostolic exhortation. And whilst both of them have similarities, this is me being a pedantic canon lawyer. They are not at the same level. Now, my question is that because, of course, an encyclical is slightly a bit more authoritative than an apostolic exhortation. Now, if in terms of the escalation of the discourse, Laudate Deum is supposed to, as it were, heighten our consciousness about the problems and therefore finding the solutions. Why the choice of a less authoritative means of communicating, a more powerful, or if you want, a more important level of the conversation? So that would be helpful. In terms of the global debt relations of the North and South, I think that of course, if we went into the WTO, for instance, we still have the room for preferential trade agreements and the various dispute settlement processes and various rules. For instance, the scientific and the phytoscientific rules, which, as it were, force some form of an imbalance, an unfairness of the trade relations, which then have influence on the financial relations and therefore heightening the gap between the economic south and economic north. There are others too who would talk about the fact that this whole conversation is hung on the hegemonic system of those of the economic north and the political north in relation to the political and economic south. And so unless that restructuring unless there's a restructuring in the concept of hegemony economically and politically, the conversation is going nowhere fast. So it will be good to see how we are going to deal with that. I'm also wanting you to look at the conversation usually goes around the issues of if you want transitioning from a posturing of competition, which then leads to protectionism in some forms, which lead to unfair if you want trade and financial relations, to a more sort of cooperative and collaborative system. But the question is it one for the other, or a mature blend of competition and cooperation? So that is my disturbance for you, Neil. I will do just a few disturbances for Prof, and then I'll let you go. Prof, whilst you were away, a certain gentleman asked a question about the role of Catholic politicians in helping with the economic progress of our country or otherwise. He was wondering why our Catholic politicians don't appear either keen or willing to help with our economic or financial progress. But my question, which I think you touched on earlier on, about the issue of accountability. The Germans have a saying that goodwill is good, but I prefer accountability. What do you suggest beyond just our knowledge to actually ask for greater accountability in our financial and economic dealings with government? But there's one that I wonder if I ask that you're not going to stop being friends with me. But it's about those of you or those of us in academia or of the epistemic world. In many jurisdictions, it is those in academia and those in the epistemic world who actually become the cadres of breaking down the understanding of how things should go to, if you want, the so-called ordinary citizens. Somehow in our milieu, there are too many of those in academia or in the epistemic world seem to be wearing various political colors, and therefore how they tackle the various issues of interest to people becomes biased, if not prejudiced. How do we deal with this perception, if it's a perception, only a perception, that if it's a reality, how do we deal with it? I think you also spoke about the structure of our tax system. I wonder if you have ideas as to how we're able to open up the tax bracket to cover more of the informal sector, but also of those in the formal sector, so that the tax burden is lowered on the very few. Having said that, I'll give the floor to Neil to start with, and then we'll go to Prof, and then the floor will be open.
Thank you very much, Father Michael, and that's some really interesting and thought-provoking comments and questions. I mean, I think on your first one around the apostolic exhortation, thank you for picking that up, and the encyclical. I mean, I think you may be better able to answer than myself, but my reflection on it is the fact of having worked closely with the Vatican on some of the climate issues. I think Pope Francis when he issued Laudato Si, I think he made it very clear what his intentions were. And I think, as you would be well aware, and I think with Fratelli Tutti, which I think kind of followed it up, I think that was very much Fratelli Tutti. This is doing it a huge disservice because it's a really rich document. But I think Fratelli Tutti was a bit like how to do Laudato Si. You know, it talks to us about actually how do you how you implement this kind of change that we want to see, this integral ecology approach, this change of our heart. So I think you're right. I think the apostolic exhortation with Laudato Deum, I think, was more because I think he felt like he'd said it, you know, and actually we just need to kind of, you know, people need to pay attention and get on with it. But I think it's a point well made. I think there's a lot of richness in the encyclicals, which, you know, do have that more, you know, do have that more standing with us and with others. And I think Fratelli Tutti is a rich source, which I probably should have used more in that sense. So I think that's well said. I think on your other point, I think that's really they absolutely get to the heart of the problem, and I think it was really clear from what the professor was saying in his presentation. Really, this comes down to an issue of power and an imbalance of power between the North and South. And so when you talk around, you know, the the kind of the economic systems and the different economic systems, I think that is why the Jubilee year offers us an opportunity to, you know, there's many different ways of looking at the principles of the Jubilee. There's inequality in our own communities, talking from the UK, inequalities, you know, across our nation, and of course inequalities across globally. And I think from my point of view, in terms of this conversation, that inequality across the nations between the rich and the poor countries is vast, and I think it needs to change. And I think that economic system, which is at the heart of that imbalance, which means that the IMF are able to implement its policies, which means that Western transnational corporations get away with taking out tax and money from a country, which means that you're not able to essentially control your own debt because of the economic system is all directed against your government. I think that is the change that we need to see in this Jubilee year, or the conversation we need to have around it. And obviously you will all do that on a national level in terms of holding your government to account, just as we do in the UK for that thing. But the fundamental economic system needs to change. And I think the last point, which I would pick up from what you said, is I think going back to Fratelli Tutti, I think it is that culture of encounter. So how do we use that time during the Jubilee year to have that culture of encounter of people so bringing people together and having that conversation, because we know by, you know, having that conversation, we are enriching ourselves, but also hopefully a way of making change. So, and there are many different ways in which we might do that. But I think starting from the Jubilee principles, I think really helps us have those maybe difficult conversations around the economics, because you are starting from the position of faith. And, you know, people may disagree with the economics and the numbers and the figures, but if you start from the principles of the Jubilee, you're starting from the principle of faith. And then I think it's easier to have a conversation, as in a culture of encounter, with people, which hopefully then starts to break down those barriers and starts to chip away at those inequalities between the global north, those rich countries, and countries such as Ghana and others who are suffering the consequences of debt, climate crisis, and others, which we've talked about and which have been illustrated very clearly by the professor. I hope that covers.
Yes, thank you very, very much. Thank you. Prof.
Yes, well, thanks a lot for your questions. I think I'll probably take your first one and the question about the role of Catholic leaders in addressing the challenges. I mean, in my view, the church in general, and in particular church in Ghana, are in such a unique position to be able to influence the direction of some of the policies and programs that we see. I think that, the Catholic Bishop Conference is one of the stronger political forces, even though it's not political in that sense, but we know how seriously both sides of the aisle take the discussions that take place there. So I feel that it's a very important platform for advocating for specific policies and programs that will improve a lot of, indeed, all Ghanaians. And then also, I mean, sometimes when I follow the discussions that come out of there, you can see that, the bishops are trying to be very upfront and honest about the challenges the country are facing. So I just wonder how, when the leaders appear in those programs, and sometimes they make some commitment and policy promises. I mean, how feasible it is to follow up and make sure that they just don't appear to come and say, we've done A, B, and C. Because I think we know through various fora, it's very difficult for ordinary Ghanaians to engage in anything that program that the politicians are undertaking. I think it's a very important platform that can be used. And regarding the question about Catholic politicians, my sense is the way our systems work is stuck against people who want to do the right thing, especially in the political arena. So building a kind of social support for, in general, Christians in general who are in authority or in power, and trying to encourage them. I mean, from my private conversations, some people will tell you it can be very lonely when you are the lone voice trying to advocate that the right thing to be done, and almost everybody seems against you. So I guess one suggestion would be perhaps continue to build an even bigger mass of faith, and perhaps encourage more people to get into positions of decision making. That way, it's easier that through their words and actions of faith, perhaps you begin to see more changes. But I mean, I think it's tough when everybody else want to do the wrong thing. You are the only island who want to do the right thing. I guess you struggle. So I'll take your last issue about how to broaden the task base. It's something that actually surprises me, that after all the reforms and the digitization we've done in 7 years, we are still having this discussion. Because it seems to me that almost all the pieces are in place. We've done Ghana card linked to our bank accounts and Momo accounts. We've done addresses. We've done so many things. It seems to me that the hard work has been done, because let's face it, there are many people who make you'll be amazed if you speak to people who are banks. Even some people we see ordinary market women, how much money people make, but they are not contributing anything. And it seems to me that once, with all the things we've done, people are buying cars and they are registering them. People are buying lands and they are registering them. People are buying properties and they are getting permission from district assemblies. So it seems to me that it's just a matter of connecting the systems. And look, most of our political leaders, they know this. If you live in an advanced country, you go and buy an expensive car, maybe with cash, not a problem. It will definitely go to HM, and then they'll get in touch. Or in the US, it will go to IRS, and suddenly they'll write to you. Then what you have been doing and what taxes you have been paying, for which you're able to generate revenue to do this. My guess is that the only reason why it hasn't happened is that the people who stand to lose the most from it are the politicians. Otherwise, after doing all the harder work, it seems surprising to me that just making sure that the systems are connected. So if you go and register an expensive property and you have not been paying taxes, it's easy for GRA to follow up with you and ask, what economic activity you have been doing? Why haven't you been paying your taxes? So I think, yeah. And then the issue about, people in positions, including academia. I mean, I think 2 weeks ago, I was shocked to my bone marrow to hear lecturers for a particular politician, and I said, "What is this? What we have got into?"
Yeah.
I think I don't know. I think that, frankly, I have no idea what we can do. I mean, there are obviously some objective voices and people who see their responsibility beyond their own personal gain, but thinking of the bigger good, who will probably engage. But frankly, if I said I know what we can do to ensure that we understand that we are in positions of responsibility, and it's not just about ourselves, then I guess, I don't know. Sorry, I think that
well, well,
what we can do.
it's fair that you have been able to engage it. Brothers and sisters, I think that I will open it up now. Please introduce yourself, and then direct your question to any of our resource persons, and then let's go.
I am Father Terence.
Father Terence, please.
Acting Executive Secretary of the Department of Human Development.
Father, would you like to increase your volume a bit more, please?
I think, can you hear me now?
It's a little too slow, too low on my side, but I don't know if the others hear you.
Can you hear me? If you can hear me, just wave your hands, and then I know that you're hearing me. Mike, can you hear me?
Okay, a bit louder now.
Yeah, it's okay.
Now? Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I did introduce myself already, and I took the opening prayer, and I had that introduction already, so I don't think I have to go over that for the sake of time. If I have another meeting, I'm supposed to be representing the president of the conference there, but I wanted to make this comment quickly before I disappear from the radar. Thank you very much, Neil and Prof, for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. I'm very much happy. But I just want to flag out some observations, maybe for our thinking processes, and see what we can do as individuals and as a country. In the President Truman, Harry S. Truman, he brought this agenda of development into the whole world, and his international economic policies led to the formation of the Bretton Woods institutions. But if you want to go to that original idea of President Truman, the economic powers of this institution were to provide technical assistance and also economic aid to developing countries, especially. And this has gone over the years. But if you see the role of IMF and the World Bank in assisting the developing countries, and you morally interrogate the way they do it, is it reflecting the original idea for which they were instituted? That is my observation. Now, Neil says that, how can they be reformed? My question will be, who kickstarts that kind of conversation with these institutions? And then back to Prof. Thank you very much. Father Kweku, you made a quick, you wanted to put Prophet. Prophet will not become your enemy, and Prof has answered well. But I look at it in this way, at least in Ghana. The academia is there, well resourced, but I think the media houses, what we do with their media houses, and oftentimes what I look on the television, I get so much worried. They bring partisan politicians for a discussion on an economy. It's only to say that I do better or I don't do better. These are the things that we hear. What is, for me, it doesn't help. Why don't they go for this academia, well-resourced profs, doctors in the universities? They will bring understanding of the economy to every Ghanaian to understand. It is not a politician. This is not the work of a politician. And that's what I want to flag out for our reflection. And the third one is what I call leadership flaws. And what I mean by leadership flaws, it is not only those in government, but all of us. All of us. I don't know what is wrong with us. I don't know what is wrong with human beings. You are put at an office. You have terms of reference. People employ you into organizations, not because you are beautiful, but because you have what it takes to do it. And so you are there. What happens? Why can't we do what we're supposed to do? We need to link up the system and make the system work. When President Obama came here, and I like one statement he made. He said, Ghana does not need strong leader, but strong institution. And these institutions are made of human beings who must be very responsible. So we have to begin the conversation with ourselves. What do we do at our offices? Because aggregation of all this is damage a country. So if I'm doing well, you are doing well, and another person is doing well, then the country is doing well. Thank you very much for my submission.
Thank you. We'll take two more for each. So please, if you have a question, just unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and shoot.
Hello.
Hello. Yes.
Yes. So I have a question each for our able presenters. The first one to Prof. And this is on the opportunity of CSOs working with the IMF. You give an example of the consultation with CSOs the IMF did. I wanted to find out, is this a standing committee, or, I mean, how can Caritas Ghana or the Bishops' Conference take advantage of this? How do we get on board? Then to Neil, I was wondering, from your work in CAFOD, from listening to Prof, and then from your own presentation, what would be your advice for the church in Ghana on practical or concrete steps we can undertake to work towards achieving or working towards the ideals of Laudato Si, especially within the framework of debt cancellation and ecology. Thank you.
So we'll take another set of questions for each resource person, and then we shall afford them the opportunity to address them.
Hello.
Is anybody else on the horizon?
Hello.
Yes, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Franklin Asarodonko.
Okay.
I'm a journalist in GBC as the deputy online editor.
Great.
I saw in the comment section someone was asking the role of the church. To the two presenters, I speak in the context of Ghana. Looking at the architecture of our governance, be it the executives, the judiciary, and the legislatures, almost 99.9% are from religious background, be it Christian or Muslims. So why are we where we are? Ghana is being choked with death because of corruption, blatant corruption. Currently, we are investigating somebody in government who has managed to purchase a hotel. And we live in a country where we don't ask the source of people's wealth. Prof, what will it take to come with a law that can allow citizens to probe and ask people their source of wealth? Then two, sometimes I think the church is partly to be blamed for the corruption that is currently going on. Why do I say so? I say so because today churches don't even ask where people get their source of funds to come and display it in church. Today, if you are not rich, no matter how sensible, knowledgeable, intelligent you are, you will never get position in the church. Those with money have been given positions. We know how much an average Ghanaian, be it the middle income people, earn. Yet we see the kind of thing people do in the church. The wealth being found around. Has any of this church or denominations asked that members, where did you get A or B from? Today we don't ask for anything. All that we do is to help people. And pastors, reverend ministers, name them. They will sit and people will come. A boy who has completed JSS or SS. You see the parents wearing white to church, going to thank God because the boy has buy car or a house. Where are we going from? So my question to the professor, as academia and people of the civil society, what are we doing as it pertains in elsewhere that people can take you to court to ask for the source of your wealth? That's one. Two, we've given so much power to certain class of people and they are doing whatever they want to do. Isn't it time to come home and say, we came out with this document, I think we should review it. Responsibility should be assigned to certain individuals. And my last question will be, should we continue to believe in what IMF and World Bank says? Because I think they are most of the problems. You know, people, you give loans to people and you come up with structures. And sometimes the consultants they bring takes half of the money away. Our politicians will take the half of what is left and go and save in the Bretton Woods institutions. And they look on. And you come out to come and blame the country and come and put restrictions which affect the very poor people we want to save. Where do you go from here? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. I think we'll deal with this and then make room for another set. I'm very conscious that once this finishes, we'll go for another round, and then we'll gradually be winding down. So we'll go to well, whichever one of you, a gentleman who wants to go first, please feel free.
Professor.
Okay, Neil.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll go for. I think I have less questions to answer than yourself. I mean, I think that I can probably wrap them up in the same answer, because I think there was a question around the reform of the IFIs, and then a very helpful question, thank you, around what's the practical stuff from our experience that Caritas Ghana or the church could be doing. And I think first of all, from our experience, and the way that most international treaties and agreements, but also about how the IMF and the World Bank function now, I think unless you're getting that pressure on a national level, then it doesn't transform into changing at the global level. So we in the UK, because we're a rich country and all of the injustices that we've talked about, we have a seat on the board of the World Bank and the IMF. So we are pushing our government to try to push for changes within the bank and the fund, but also to, you know, the fact that we shouldn't be, you know, it shouldn't be us. So I think on a national level, I think it's around how do you encourage your own government to push for these reforms, but also how do you hold them accountable for the things that they've said they're going to do. So look at their nationally determined contribution plan, look at their action plan for the SDGs, look in it, and is that acceptable? Is that what you would want them to be spending money? So if money comes into Ghana, is that what you would want that money to be spent on? Do you think that is critical in terms of what, you know, the communities that you all work with very closely, is that what you want it spent on? And make sure that that money is spent on them, you know, just as, you know, that's the same in many countries. So I think there's that accountability on a national level. And then I think about, you know, raising your voices on an international level. How can you do that? Well, SECAM, as we know, the conferences of the African Bishops' Conferences have a formal relationship with the African Union, and the African Union are now part of the G20. So how can you work through SECAM to get to the African Union and to make sure that that voice on at the African Union at the G20 is really strong? So how can you, as church in Ghana, actually, how can you raise these issues that we've all talked about here and make sure that they are on the agendas of things like the G20? The G20 is probably the most powerful group. Unless if the G20 agree, then it kind of filters out into things like the climate talks and into other bits around. So the current debt mechanism, the common framework, came out of the G20. So the G20 is a really important place. And the South Africa has the presidency of the G20 next year. So personally, I'm really hopeful because I think the South African presidency has a really ambitious a program, and I think it really wants to make it a very African, obviously, G20 presidency, which I think speaks to all of the things that we've talked about here. So I think working through SECAM, working through the African Union, getting your voices heard on those international levels. And I think, you know, we know that next year is the Jubilee year. The Caritas campaign is around debt. So how can we all raise our voices, you know, into these spaces? The professor will talk about how you can get into these civil society spaces within the IMF. But we can do that as Caritas. You know, I was in Washington with Caritas Africa. Fantastic. We had Lucy there doing some brilliant stuff. Caritas Ghana has done some amazing things, feeding statements into before G20 meetings and before other meetings. And again, how do we raise your voices into those spaces? You know, we can certainly take your voices and raise them through the UK channels into the UK voices and spaces as well. So we would be very happy to do that. So I think practically, I think that's it. It's working out your kind of what you say and thinking about how you can best get it into the voices or into the heads of those decision makers. The African Union through SECAM, making sure the G20 is a real focus for you, but also using the Caritas campaign next year and the Jubilee campaign next year to really kind of raise your voices into those international spaces as well. But we're very happy to help in all of those things as well. Thank you.
Right. Well, Prof.
Okay, thank you. So let me start with two related questions about whether the fund and the bank are deviating from their original mandate and whether they're still helpful and useful. Yeah, so it's interesting to hear this question. There's I teach a class where I ask students to debate something. There's one paper on the World Bank, why it still fails and why it's still needed, or something like that. I ask the students to come and present on. And I think you are right that in particular, the bank has sort of moved on from where it was originally set up. You know, it started as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. These days, it's sort of become more of a knowledge bank, and they are doing things, all manner of different things. I think what we have to understand that the bank and the fund believe in a certain way of organizing the economy. They believe in a certain economic and political ideology of how economy should run. And I think, I mean, every time we go there, especially with every time we go into an IMF program, we have to be clear what we will get and what we will not get. I think many people in Ghana, we've been there 17 times. People are wondering, why do you keep going 17 times? Because the IMF is not going to solve the most important challenges that we face. So we mess ourselves up and then we say, oh, on our own, we can't put our house in order. So we need the headmaster to come and help us put us in order. So the IMF just, allow us to implement things that are painful and bring us some temporary stability. I think what is important is, that we as, citizens, we ensure that we let our government know that those programs are very costly. They're extremely costly. And that, we do what it takes to ensure that we transform and we reform. Unfortunately, that's what's not happening. That's what is not happening. And that's why we keep going back. If you think that the IMF is what will fix our economy and make it less import dependent or less dependent on foreign financing, or make sure that we build a stronger production base, or we are transforming agriculture and we are generating opportunities for the poor, that's not going to happen. I think we are completely mistaken if we think that that's what the IMF stands for. That's not what they stand for. In fact, sometimes they will tell you that those things are micro things, and they think that the World Bank that should be involved in. So I think there's been some small mission creep, some form of mission creep has happened. And I think the ideology and how the IMF and the World Bank think the world works mostly doesn't work in poor countries. And I think that's something, it's up to our political leaders and also academia and other people to understand this and say, okay, hopefully this is our last. Whatever stability that we are getting, let us build on it and let's use it to build a stronger economy. I think, but the damage that the IMF and the World Bank has done, not just to people, but to even how we think about economy, is pretty serious. So you see that the only thing that politicians want to look to judge how the economy is doing is to quote inflation to you, to quote growth rate to you, to quote exchange rate to you. There's no discussion about how many people are moving out of poverty, even when we are reading our budget. So our years of association with this has kind of changed how we think about how we should even be measuring our progress. So I think that, do they offer some opportunities? Probably, because if you become a country that decides that you are going to play in the international financial market, unfortunately, some of those players will look at what the IMF is saying about your economy. But it's possible to break the chain and say, no, this time we are going to manage ourselves, we're going to fix our economy. That way, we can build the economy we want, the way we understand it and the way we can. So, in some sense, it's a necessary evil when you've messed yourself up, like we have done. But you have to understand that it's like a doctor. Maybe they might give you some drug and then to bring your sickness down a little bit. But if you return to doing the things that make you sick, you'll always be sick. I think that is where we need to take more responsibility on our own. Then there's a question about engaging with the fund on the program. So actually, since the 16th IMF program, that's when I knew about it. They've set up, it's a kind of a loose group of people that we know that every time they come for the review, they meet a group. So I was invited to the group by a friend, one of my colleagues. So I think that what I can do is probably to put Caritas Ghana in touch, because there are a lot of NGOs focusing on different things who are part. So when we go for those meetings, they are there, and each one present issues that are of concern to them related to the program. So we usually meet and occasionally sometimes they will ask us to submit whatever you care about. Just submit a small, like 2-paragraph write-up. So it's very easy to feed into the discussion. So I think what I can do is just have a discussion with the person who leads the group and then see how that can go.
That'll be very helpful.
Otherwise, I think what have I missed? I mean the others were comment about how media houses and who they choose to put on the platform to discuss what. There was a question about wealth declaration and how. So I kind of alluded to that partially in my initial response. I think that is a very strong point that in many other societies, it's very unusual that if you are spending lavishly out of what is your expected revenue, something will be triggered. And then some explanation will be required and some audit to take place. Like I said, I strongly believe that it's because in our context, the political and the economic elite are the ones who also make the policies and laws. They are the ones who stand to lose the most. So perhaps, but personally, I think one of the best opportunities to force any important reform in Ghana is when we have just the 1 month between election and the changeover of new government. Because that is the period where you recall that is when Mr. Domelevo, who many Ghanaians saw as doing a lot to help with the public sector corruption. That's when he was appointed. So I feel that is where a government is going, and it feels that whatever it can do to make sure that the next government is more accountable. I think that's a small opportunity, but what do I know?
Okay. All right, Prof. Thank you. I'll take the last round of questions. As I can see, we have already gone over our budgeted time. So we'll just take a last round, very quick questions for our resource persons, and then we will begin to come to the end of this session. If there aren't any, then I suspect that as I feel, the two resource persons have been more than excellent in their presentations, and so I will then move to the next item on the. Oh, okay. Please identify yourself and then direct your question.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bernard Anaba. I work for ISODEC. Mine is not a question, but just a comment.
Okay.
And I really want to congratulate the professor and Neil for the wonderful presentation and the thought that they have given us and provoked all of us. Really very good. So I want to add to the point that all the problems we are discussing, the complicity of the IMF, the World Bank, and this. But I realize that there is a certain failure that is happening globally among humanity in general. That over time, leadership have realized that the masses or the people are very slow to respond. So they are very lazy in accounting. They don't want to account. They don't want to be responsible because nothing really happens to them. So that is happening over time. So it means that a lot of the things that we are talking about, even at the global level, they make a lot of promises, very laudable promises, but they never fulfill any of them and they get away with it. At the country level, governments come, you see that they are doing the wrong thing, but they don't listen to anybody. Look at the presentations that the professor made, very elucidating and very a lot of wisdom within it that you would have expected that, well, why wouldn't a country listen to these ideas, and it's all over the place, but leadership will never listen because they have realized that people are very slow to respond or to react. and they get away with it. So they never, and that's what's happening over the world. So we perhaps from the civil society level or from the church level or the faith level, we should begin mobilizing at the community level, getting ourselves educated and, getting ourselves, solidarizing ourselves and looking at the issues together. When they realize that we are together and in terms of our voting part and other things, they will begin to listen to us because they think that we are divided, we don't respond, so they can get away with so many things. So we should spend more of our resources to mobilize at the community level, to get people educated so that all these issues come up, so that we're able to confront them even at the grassroots level, then up to the national level. Otherwise, it's going to get worse and worse and worse because leadership gets away with it all over, not only in Ghana, but around the world all over. And that is one of the biggest problems. And I also want to congratulate the Catholic Church for the Jubilee movement. When you look at biblically, death is taken seriously, and it gives, when you look at the books of Leviticus, it asks for, death forgiveness after a certain period of time, because death is such a way that when you allow it to compound, it becomes a tool of control for the powerful. The control, and even, it gets us, and that's the state that we are now, that the powerful are using death to control poor countries, so that whatever you come at the international level, because you have so much debt on your neck, whatever you are asked to do, do it. And that's what is happening. So the faith community can also, add more voice to it to see that we have a lot of this debt forgiveness and debt cancellation. It's really very essential because the pile of debt is such a way that we are never really going to get out of it. And like the professor said, in the next few years, we are still going to be back to where we are because the level of debt is such that we will try and try and try. We'll only be breaking our neck and nothing really happens. And those who are in the helm of affairs, they know that. Once they have us under their thumb and they're able to control us, they just pay lip service to a lot of these things. So that is just my contribution to what we have discussed so far. Thank you and over.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you very, very much. I think that we will take that of Bernard as the last contribution or intervention. Is there anyone else?
Yes, hello.
Okay. Is it that Shadrach?
Yes, that's Shadrach.
Okay, Shadrach, I think you will be the last for us.
Okay, so my question is to Prof. From all the discussions, it appears it's as a result of fiscal deficit, which is because of excess spending over the revenue. And then he mentioned in his contribution that there should be expenditure control measures, which has been difficult. So I'm asking, how does he think we as a church or Caritas Ghana can also help to ensure the expenditure control measures? And then my second question is to Neil. In his presentation, he also mentioned that they are putting in place, they'll be having a meeting in 2 weeks' time or so to ensure that this recurrence doesn't happen again, in the sense that they can forgive our debt, then we come back again with the same issue. And then what are some measures you also think we can put in place to ensure this doesn't happen in the future? Thank you.
Prof first, and then Neil.
Okay. So what can we do to put in expenditure controls? Well, I think here's the thing. I'll tell you about what happened in the IMF 16. That is still in the IMF 17. So the IMF felt that we should have a fiscal responsibility act, and in that act to ensure that there's some control over, or government is written in the law. Government cannot do A, B, and C. I think what the IMF always misses is that we are very good at putting things in law and on paper, and we find ways not to implement them. That's exactly what happened. On this occasion, we decided to make the law in such a way that it's so loose that there are so many loopholes, and that's what we did. And it's the same thing that has happened in the current program, where we say we want everything to go through the expenditure management program, the expenditure management. I think one of the main problems is absence of consequence when people violate the law. it happens many times. Even the Bank of Ghana did it. When against the law, they lent more to the government than what the law allows. But nobody has done anything. So I think perhaps, so one of the things that I've seen is that there's a discussion about ensuring that there's enforcement and consequences for people who publicly violate the law. I think that is very important. That's a very important component. That when something is clearly written that we can't do this, and somebody does it, the punishment is exerted. We've seen that the political class on their own, they won't do it. And I think that is why it's important that as civil society and church organizations, faith organizations, we should rally and support the independent state institutions. Because we saw that when, all the violations had been going on for decades, but it took one person, Domelevo, to try and then start imposing and issuing the sanctions. And unfortunately, we saw what happened to him. I mean, the politicians will fight back, and that's exactly what they did, and he was removed. So I think when occasions like this happen, I think it helps that there are so many voices that are issuing statements and showing the support. I think that kind of brings some pressure on the political leaders to know if they realize that almost every entity, just like what recently happened with the Galamsey fight, right? All manner of professional bodies, all manner of organizations issue statement, and they felt obliged to act. So when people are trying to undermine some of the independent state institutions that are especially supposed to help to fight the corruption, I think it's important that we all speak out in support. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come to Neil.
Thank you very much. I mean, briefly, two things, as I said, which I think you picked up on, Shadrach, which was I think there's at the COP, at the climate talks in 2 weeks, there will be agreeing the next climate finance, so the new collective quantified goals, or how much money is to be agreed internationally, which then goes down into countries. So that's really important. So that's going to be happening in the next 2 weeks. And I think, how do you prevent it in the next time? I think there are very clear policy outcomes out there. So essentially a independent UN debt mechanism, which allows countries to come together and work out in a fair and transparent way how that you move forward when a country gets into a debt crisis. I can share details of it, but it's been out there for a long time. It's absolutely critical. It's really fair, and it's really what the world should have. It's like, if a company gets into trouble with a debt, there is a mechanism in which a company can go into bankruptcy, and there's all sorts of ways that happens. For a country, there is nothing there, and this is one of the ways in which it can deal with that stuff, but make sure it doesn't happen going forward into the future. So that's something I think which is a really strong call for Caritas Ghana to be making over this next Jubilee year. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I would have loved for this to continue, but as you can see, we've already exceeded half an hour past our agreed timeline. So I'll now invite Mr. John Ohineba Akwa of Ghana Caritas to give us some closing remark and announcement, and then there'll be a feedback survey. Before I invite Ishak Abeka Mensa to then lead us in a closing prayer. Do we have Mr. Ohinebakwa there?
Yes, Father.
Please.
Good. So good evening to all the participants on this learning platform. Much has been said, and more needs to be done. CSOs, LBOs, media, individuals. The question is, are we really ready, willing, and committed to push our government to revise its fiscal budgetary policies and the like, and even go further to as Professor Assumes did say, to influence the IMF also to change its policy about his debt cancellation or restructuring and the like. I don't think today ends everything. We need to do more to save our country. Because at the end of the day, it is you and I who are going to benefit, as well as the future generation. So on this note, I would like to say a big thank you to our resource personnel, to Mr. Neil Thorns, and to Professor Patrick Asumi. Thanks for accepting to lead us in these discussions and learning session. We wish for God's blessing for all of you in your ministry, in your work. I would like also to thank Father Kweku for moderating this learning session, because it's not always easy with these up and downs of technology. Thanks for your effort, thanks for your service, and thanks for your lead. And to all the participants who are on this learning platform, we wish we can continue. As you know, there's time for everything. Thanks for availing yourself. And we believe that the next time we call you for this learning session, you'll be there for us to have a good conversation, how best we can help our country. But it's you and I, not anybody else. Again and again, thanks for showing up. Then, we would also like to send you a feedback form, which we are pleading that everybody should do well to fill it. And that will help us to design our next learning session. Again and again, thanks for availing yourself join this laudable virtual conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ohinaba Akwa. Do we have any other announcements from Mr. Akrogo before I say a thing or two and move on to the closure? Does the Executive Director have anything to say to us?
So thank you, Father. Actually, I don't have much else to say apart from to appreciate you all for this wonderful encounter. Definitely we'll be following up with you to see how to take this to the next level. So expect us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. I'll say a thing or two. In terms of solutions versus problems, I'm very much a student of Emil Durkheim, who says that since the problems of society come from society, the solutions to problems of society must come from society. So you know, it behooves of all of us, because the problems have come from society and not dropped from heaven. We must all work within our own milieux to help solve the problem. But whilst I am, you know, ideologically very opposed to Karl Marx, because he was you know, a communist and I am not. I'm very much a capitalist. There's one thing that he said that I always believe in, that if the masses are angry enough, there will be a change. I want to you know, paraphrase that by saying that if we are disgusted enough about the economic injustice and the injustice against our environment, then we will act. So let us be a bit more angry about the injustices going on economically and environmentally, and we will act. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention and participation. And I'll now invite Ishak Abekamensa of the Ahmadiyya movement to lead us in a closing prayer.
Thank you very much. I will urge all of us to usher ourselves in prayers. We'll do a silent prayer. Then after, I will just give a closing prayer and say amen at the end of the day. So let us pray. ربنا أتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم آمين.
Amen. So we thank you very much, Ishak. I thank you all, especially Prof. and Neil. And until the next time when we are convened by Mr. Kurgu and his various experts in Caritas Ghana, it's been great having you, and it is cheerio. God bless.
Hello, Father.
Bye, Prof.
Hello, Father. This is Emmanuel.
Oh, Emmanuel, yes.
We also want to acknowledge Lumen Christi TV and try as much to circulate this event also on social media handles so that we can have greater people taking part and understanding what is also going on in the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, see you all before too long, and God bless.